Well, hello, YouTube and TikTok. DW is once again streaming live from Berlin. I'm Gerhard Elfers. Welcome to you all. And with me in the studio from DW Business,
I'm Stephen Beardsley. Good to have you with us. Good to be here, Gerhard.
Yeah, good to have you here, Stephen. So let's look at the latest developments in the US-Iran standoff. President Donald Trump now says he'll extend the pause on strikes against Iran's energy infrastructure by another 10 days, pushing it into April, and insisting talks with Tehran are, quote, going very well. But Iran says it isn't talking to the US at all. And on the ground, there's zero sign of a slowdown. Retaliatory strikes continue at the Strait of Hormuz. Remember, that's the narrow gateway for roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas. That is still effectively choked off by Iran.
That's right, and that's sending shockwaves through global markets. Wall Street just posting its worst day since the conflict began, and Asia is bracing for the next hit. Investors in Tokyo, Seoul, and Hong Kong are, of course, watching those extra 10 days with special anxiety. Will they bring stability, or will they just prolong uncertainty?
Well, you can expect energy prices to stay high, shipping routes strained, and consumer costs to keep creeping upwards, from fuel and transport to everyday goods that rely on global supply chains. We'll break down what all that means in a minute. First, we were looking at Asia, especially at India, and then at Africa. Lots of very unpleasant effects hitting both continents. And we'll try and explain why markets are reacting the way they are. Stephen, at least, will try to explain
I'll do my best.
To me. I don't know enough about that. And also how these next 10 days could shape the economic outlook for hundreds of millions of people worldwide, and possibly you as well. Now, people, do drop your questions in the comments below. I'll try to get them across to Stephen and, of course, to our other experts. Now, Stephen, before we talk, let's listen in to the British Foreign Minister, Yvette Cooper, who's been speaking at a G7 meeting that's happening right now just outside of Paris.
130 countries have come together at the United Nations to condemn Iran's egregious aggression towards the Gulf states and also its attacks on international shipping. And that is so important because Iran cannot hold the global economy hostage as a result of what it is doing.
Well, Stephen, holding the global economy hostage, is that a description that fits, you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is a message coming from the G7 and G7 allies, so obviously it's going to have a very political slant to it. Iran would argue it's trying to survive and it's doing everything within its means, and others would also argue that Washington knew exactly that what Iran would do, that it should have every reason to have known that Iran would do what it's doing in the Strait of Hormuz. But in a way, she is right. There is so much energy and other products that run through that small channel or that small strait that essentially it is holding the world economy in hostage in a way. Mm-hmm. What's funny is that about a year ago, Gerhard, I was actually in Frankfurt, where the big stock exchange for Germany is located, because I was reporting on tariffs being announced, right? Liberation Day. And that also felt like a very similar moment to right now, in which you see these kinds of ups and downs of the markets. Everyone's waiting to see what's going to happen next, when the next shoe is going to drop, when something's going to be called off. It's very reminiscent of where we were just 1 year ago.
Now, we've seen, let's look at the markets. We've seen US markets take a hit, S&P 500, Dow Jones, both down. What does it mean for average consumers in the US?
Yeah, for average consumers in the US, it may not mean much right away if stocks are going down, but it's really two things. One is that it shows that this announcement of a kind of cessation of or I guess this extension of a deadline, let's call it, right? It's not necessarily a cessation of hostilities, but that they don't really buy that something's going to be figured out in this time. They don't really see a resolution coming, and that they instead see a bunch of uncertainty that's still sort of lingering. And then the other thing that it tells us is that there are fears that because uncertainty is lingering and because prices are still high and there's been no resolution to this issue with the Strait of Hormuz, that prices are still high, that there's the fear of a global recession, that a lot of these issues are going to anchor in really hard, and they're going to affect the global economy in such a way that normal people are going to feel it. People who aren't investing in the stock market and may not otherwise care, they're already feeling it, obviously, at the fuel pumps. They're going to see it potentially in their food soon, in other products where shipping costs are going to rise. And so that's what it is. It's an early signal of hey, we're not really convinced right now, and just FYI, this is only going to get worse. The best phrase I've heard is time is not on our side in this case. That's what the markets are saying.
Now, another part of the market is the NASDAQ, which is very tech-heavy, lots of tech companies in there. That has fallen even more than other US indices. In simple terms, why are tech stocks being hit so hard by this?
I mean, from my understanding, obviously you have a pessimistic sentiment across Wall Street right now, but the NASDAQ is tech heavy, and there's some special issues there that have come up, right? So Meta has this court ruling that went against them in a major civil lawsuit that paves the way for other lawsuits against it and potentially Google, right? Because of social media issues. You have some other issues affecting memory chips, Google unveiling a new AI feature that is going to affect that industry. And so there was especially a hard hit in NASDAQ right now, but does it have so much bearing on the broader Wall Street concerns? It may be more its own direction right now.
Now, let's look at Europe. The big markets there, like the DAX in Germany, London's FTSE, are slipping. Is that a sign, just a sign that the global mood is darkening, or is there more behind that?
Absolutely. I think it's all about the global mood right now. I think that you see industries in the DAX, for example, that are really getting hit harder are those who have a global footprint. And because frankly, most of them in the German lead index have a global footprint. Siemens, for example, they're going to be hit hard if there's any signs of a global recession. And that's what we're seeing. Again, this reminds me very much of a year ago in which all the signs were really gathering, the storm clouds gathering over the global economy. And so you see broad-based losses across many different sectors. And that says, look, we see hard times coming, right? If the energy prices remain high, then that's a threat of inflation. If the threat of inflation remains high, then central banks are going to raise interest rates. That means that borrowing gets harder. That means that businesses have to cut back, personal households cut back with their spending, and that's a bad situation. And that's what we're signaling right now, is that this is what we see on the horizon when something doesn't get better.
Now, another thing is that government borrowing costs, like US and UK bond yields, are staying high for somebody who is not really into finance that much. What does that mean for average people like me?
Again, this goes back to the expectation that interest rates are going to have to rise more. And so you're already seeing them creep up in terms of interest rates on the market right now for bonds. And what that means is, for people at home, it means things like mortgages get more expensive. It means the purchase of a car gets more expensive. If you look at a mortgage in particular, this is a really bad time for the US, for example, which has been having a housing market crisis for a couple of years now. Things were starting to thaw out and actually look a little bit better. You know, this spring, there was a lot of anticipation that the housing market would really start to come back. And now what do you see? You see that actually borrowing rates are ticking up. It's something that actually the president doesn't want, and his party probably doesn't want, to bring this to a political area. But that's where people are going to notice as well, Gerhard. They're going to look at it and they're going to say, you know, I had planned on making a house purchase so far, or this spring. I'd held off because interest rates were so high. They've started to back off, and now for the past 4 weeks, they've gone back up again. That's not good for the economy. That's not good for the overall market there. And if you're a politician, that's not good if you're in the president's party.
Absolutely. Now, before we go and have a closer look at Asia, I just want to bring up the oil prices. They're back above $110 a barrel. We've all seen prices rise at the pumps. It also sort of filters down to groceries, flights, heating, all that primarily. Where do you see this going? Are we going to see further rises because people find it quite unattractive as it is right now?
It's incredibly unattractive, right? Whether you own a car or not, this will affect you, right? So if you own a car, obviously you're fueling up and you see this right away, and it's hitting you in your pocketbook already. If you don't, you're going to see it working its way into the cost of shipping. And you may already see it in jet fuel, for example. We're seeing ticket prices rise for vacations. But there are also shippers who are, reliant on long-term fixed contracts. And once they start being renewed with their customers, they're going to go up at higher rates, and that's going to be passed down more and more. You'll see it in food. You'll see it in other products. That's the fear. In terms of how high it can go, we talk with economists all the time, and they've generally given a worst-case scenario was 150 plus. Iran has said it would like to see it go up to $200. So there's a very political aspect to this as well. How high can we get it if we're Iran? What is the pain that we can extract? 110 is not great. 100 is also this kind of threshold that we generally talk about for causing pain, really eating away at growth on an economy. And so we're there right now, and if it holds that way, then it's really going to have an effect on global economies. It's really going to take away potential growth, and it could slip everyone into recession. So it depends on what happens, Gerhard. It really just depends on what's going to happen. I know that this is what everyone says, the experts say, and they're right. We have to see what happens.
Yeah. You don't have your crystal ball with you, too.
I forgot it today.
Damn. I have a question which is interesting, and maybe you can explain. Dogman Vic asks on YouTube that fuel can be made out of so many items these days. It's not just oil, but the world economy still runs on oil, does it not?
Yeah, for sure, and that's for sure. There are other things like biogas, for example, things like that, but they're not made at such a scale to really be able to replace one for one the disappearance of oil. We should also mention there are different types of fuel products as well, including diesel. And diesel is one that we've taken a look at in recent weeks because those prices have actually eclipsed petrol prices.
Why is that?
Because diesel is taxed lower here in Europe. And so this is the difference between Europe and the US, is that diesel is taxed at a lower rate. And that's made it cheaper, and that's actually encouraged the kind of development of a passenger car diesel kind of boom that you don't see in the US, but you see here.
Very much
diesel
so,
has eclipsed it because so much of diesel comes through the Strait of Hormuz. It's processed there. It's a product that comes out. Europe
arrives here ready to...
It arrives here ready, and Europe doesn't have many other alternatives. One reason for that, Gerhard, is because they stopped importing that from Russia after the war in Ukraine. So they're especially dependent on the Persian Gulf, and when that channel is cut off, unlike with other petrol products, they can't just go elsewhere and immediately make it up. Diesel shoots through the roof, and that means that actually a lot more drivers of passenger cars are going to feel that. But to get back to his answer, or his question, it really is the case of there are plenty of options, but a lot of those products are already coming through the Strait as well, and things like biogas, it's just the scale isn't there.
So thank you, Dogman Vic, for that question. And I'd like to zoom out a bit and have a look at Asia, which is feeling the shockwaves of the Hormuz choke point more than anyone else right now. Nearly 90% of the oil and gas that normally passes through that strait is bound for this region, putting Asian economies right on the front line of the fuel crunch. And governments are scrambling for solutions. South Korea has slapped a ban on naphtha exports. That's a key ingredient in making petrochemicals and plastic. And it's even dimming the lights at its presidential offices. Vietnam has dropped its environmental fuel tax to slash prices at the pumps by a quarter, while Singapore is delaying its green jet fuel levy to avoid extra pressure on airlines. Meanwhile, in Thailand, surging diesel costs have already docked more than half of the fishing fleet at the country's biggest port. Fishermen are warning Thailand's multi-billion-dollar fisheries sector will nearly come to a standstill after April 1st, unless the government intervenes. So across Asia, the message is quite clear. The energy squeeze is here, and the fallout is already hitting consumers, industries, and daily life. Stephen, I've just seen that you've taken a note. You want to refer to any of this before we go to our expert on?
You know, what I wrote down is the fact that Singapore is removing this kind of excise tax, essentially, or maybe it was actually a tax on green fuels, I guess. And this is one thing that we're seeing more countries debate or actually start to do, is how do you lower the taxes that are on a product or built within it? So like excise taxes, for example, that are built into petrol and diesel costs. Here in Europe, there are a lot of them. There's a carbon levy, there's a general sort of energy tax. That makes these fuel products so much more expensive here, but that also means that in times of trouble, you could actually unwind them and lower the price. The question is, do you want to do that? And there are two reasons not to. One is that it takes away government revenues they might need. The other is that it actually encourages people to buy more fuel at a time when you actually don't want to encourage them to consume. But this is really a tricky thing, I think, for politicians, is that you have to figure out how do you satisfy people, make sure that they're happy, because fuel costs can be a real frustration for people. And then how do you make sure that you're sending the right economic signal? So I think we're going to see this kind of debate of what do you cut, what do you continue?
Now let's have a look at India now with the economist Dr. Shaun Ray. She's with the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, joins us from Delhi now. Welcome to our live stream here, Professor. How exposed is India to the current disruption through the Strait of Hormuz, given its heavy reliance on Middle Eastern supplies?
Thank you. India is very exposed. because we import 85 to 88% of crude oil, and about 40 to 45% of crude actually comes from the Gulf, from the Strait of Hormuz. And there are, of course, limited domestic substitutes, though renewable is growing. So in terms of oil, we are very exposed, but I think institutionally we are much better prepared than before. There are strategic reserves. We have diversified our suppliers to Russia, now thinking of buying from the US as well, and other countries as well. Now, in terms of the, the energy mix of the country, a lot of it is still coal. So, about 50% is still coal. Oil is about 25 to 30%. So in terms of that, there will be a lot of pressure, particularly on road transport, certain industries, and other sectors as well, as if the crisis continues for a long time.
That brings me straight to my next question. What immediate pressures do you expect for Indian industry, and which parts of Indian industry?
Right. So, there has been, so industries which were using gas, there has been some pressure on that, because initially there were some bottlenecks as far as gas is concerned. But then what we are hearing now, that there are stocks, and there are about reserves of 60 days. But some industries have been particularly hit. We are hearing that there are some anecdotally, some textile clusters, pharmaceuticals, fertilizers, chemicals. These are the sectors which have been are likely to be very hard hit, largely because, especially in fertilizers and chemicals, a lot of feedstock actually uses natural gas, and we are dependent heavily on natural gas from the Middle East.
Now, is this, or in which way is this already feeding into inflation for ordinary Indian households?
Right. So so there was a little bit of a shortage of LPGs, the liquefied petroleum gas cylinders. That has been taken care of, and now we are hearing that there are enough stocks, and the government has actually taken measures to, for city gases, city household gas, the LNG, to move to the LNG kind of, and the PNG, sorry, as far as that concerned. But then the thing is that the transport sector is likely to be very badly hit, and we are hearing rising fuel costs. It's already increasing the cost of transport. So food transport, a lot of transport actually, food particularly, fresh vegetables, etc., is actually uses trucks in the country. So we are seeing immediate increases in price of fresh vegetables, etc. And if it continues for some more time, then it might lead to pressures on other industries as well. But for the immediate, in the short term, what we're seeing is that small increases in food prices.
What kind of pressures are there on the Indian population there when it comes to prices? And how sensitive is the Indian public to rising fuel costs, rising food costs, and then what measures has the government proposed?
Right. The Indian population, there's a lot of there's a huge section of the population which is actually not so well off. And they're very dependent on fuel. Is a very important cost that is as part of the household cooking, etc. So lots of things have been proposed, things like, and a lot of people who could afford have also shifted to other electric options. So, you hear the shift to more electric induction cookers and all of that. There has been an increase in the price of fuel wood. So people, that kind of options are also being taken. Now, the government has assured that there is, in fact, no immediate shortage of LPG or petrol for the matter, petrol or diesel for the matter. Some excise duties have also been reduced to take care of the problem. And the government is actively encouraging people to switch to PNG, pipe natural gas wherever it's possible. And many kinds of options are being taken at the moment.
And I'm afraid we have to leave it there. And I would like to thank you very much to Dr. Saun Ray with the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations in New Delhi. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Gerhard, isn't it interesting, this idea that people are suddenly switching already to even wood?
Wood,
right?
yeah, that I found quite scary.
And I think this goes into this idea of what economists call demand destruction, right? Mm-hmm. And that's probably just a temporary change, right? People are taking a very quick switch that they can. If they can't get fuel or fuel costs are too high, then they go to something that's clearly there, it's cheaper. But the question is, as long as this goes on, and fuel costs remain so prohibitively high for many people, how do they change their behavior over the long term? And we look at this maybe in other countries like Europe and the US. Does the market for electric vehicles suddenly become more attractive? At what point is that the case? At what point do people really change their behavior? So it's interesting to see. Obviously, people make changes already. I'm sure people are driving less in certain parts of the world. They're doing what they can do. But then how does that change it fundamentally the longer this goes?
Now, let's have a look at our YouTube comments. There's lots of chat about climate change and green energy, Steve. Seiki Mashan says, climate change can be a benefit from what's happening, but the effect takes longer due to current weather or climate state. And Natsia is saying this war is the best advertisement for green energy. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first one, and it probably won't be the last one, because it is a long, slow slog to get to this kind of energy transition, and not all countries are on board, of course. But yeah, that's a comment that's being made frequently here in Europe and elsewhere, saying, look, another energy shock, another shock because of reliance on one region, one country. Europe, of course, faced that in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine. It was highly dependent on Russia for gas in particular. Once gas prices shot up, that caused all sorts of problems here. And around the world. So back then, I think, what was it, the finance minister at the time called renewable energy freedom energy, right? And the idea was we're going to have to really focus on this, because otherwise we're dependent on nations that we don't want to be. Well, things change, especially as the economy sours, and we're just trying to get sort of the economies back up into shape more. And that, in Europe, that has really shifted the conversation away from that in recent years. But this is a new reminder that, hey, there is something to be said for having this kind of independence as much as possible. There are technical limits right now. The grid build-outs take a long, long time. There is a lot of things like solar and wind still being built out, but how do you manage that in the grid? So it is still an ongoing process, and the user is exactly right. It makes a very valid point about using the options that you have available that don't require going to these outside countries.
Also, you mentioned Russia there. Russia currently really benefiting from the high oil price, right?
Yeah, and we expected this from the beginning, right? It was just the high oil price that we knew would be a benefit for them, right? Because they have a break-even point, and oil prices before this war started were actually quite low, and they were struggling mightily.
Well, they're 70, 80, around
they were
that
They were around 60, and then they jumped
60.
up to 70 right before, in the 60s, and they jumped up to 70, low 70s right before the war came, as the signs were pointing towards that. And so there was much more supply than there was demand. So a lot of slack in the system, and we were really talking about how Russia was struggling. And then this happened, and we said, look, the prices are going to go up. They're going to start benefiting more. But not just that, right? Because now the U.S. has said we're going to remove sanctions on Russian oil.
Yeah.
That means a lot of oil that was out there sitting around. We heard our guests saying that they're also taking more from Russia. So they don't just have the price where they want it, but they have the buyers where they want it. And that's completely legal now from, or it's not sanctioned, I should say, from the U.S. like it was. So they are certainly benefiting.
Let's come back to green energy or alternatives to oil. Green energy is one thing that, of course, can be pursued and is being pursued by many countries. Germany, for example, has done that a lot. But the world economy running on oil doesn't only affect energy. It is also, oil is a base product for a lot more than that. Pharmaceuticals, plastics, and all that. So how likely is it that we can, even if we reduce our dependence on energy production, on oil, for example, that we can move away even further from oil?
I mean, the idea would be that you would move away to such an extent that you would not be so heavily dependent on one region. When you are not just dependent on oil for the production of base products like pharmaceuticals, like plastics, which are probably, that's going to continue into the future, but when you are reliant on it for every means of transportation, for the most part, then you're going to have a heavy dependence on large supplies coming around the world. And that's why the Persian Gulf is so important, is because of transportation, because we move our products, we move ourselves with oil. If it was different, if the demand was much, much lower, you would see, of course, the price fall, and you would see that there would still be alternative locations that could provide that. Not everything would be so hinged or around one critical strategic area. So, yes, there will always be demand for that, but it's because of the level of demand that makes these certain areas of the world so important, and has made them that way for the last 50 years.
Now, you've mentioned the sort of the wake-up call that especially countries like Germany received when the war against Ukraine broke out. And Germany has decided to sort of pull out of nuclear energy, for example. Doesn't really directly relate to oil, but it used to be part of the energy equation, if you will, in this country. Now, nuclear seems to make a comeback across Europe. Even Ursula von der Leyen recently said it was a strategic mistake by Germany. Had Germany not switched off these nuclear reactors, would that have made a big difference?
Yeah, that's a big question. Ursula von der Leyen has said that it was a mistake to move away from it so quickly. Germany has held on to its position, even under a new government, saying that that chapter is closed. We're not doing that anymore. But it was the cause of a lot of political discussion in the country here. And what it relates to renewables, because there's still the need for reliable baseload. And that means that you have to have something that you can start up and that can run quietly and consistently in the background and isn't so dependent on the time of day, like solar, or specific wind patterns, because we don't have a way of effectively storing and moving renewable energy from one part to another. Now, there's batteries, things like this that are sort of coming online, but it's taking a long time. So reliable base load is really what it's about. And right now in Germany, they're focusing more on gas for that. They're going to be building a lot more gas power plants in the coming years, which is also controversial for those who are more on the sort of the climate protection side. But nuclear feeds into that discussion of how do you create that reliable baseload. France is really going to emphasize that. They have for decades. They're really focusing on these smaller reactors. Germany has said, no thanks, we're still not interested. So it will continue to be a debate, to be honest.
Talking about gas, Qatar, of course, being one of the major gas producers, also affected both by the Hormuz closure and also by consistent or repeated attacks on their infrastructure. How big a role does gas, LNG, liquefied natural gas, play in this? It's not just oil, but in terms of which level, in which way does gas contribute to this energy crisis?
It's very important. It depends on who's taking that gas. For Europe, it's significant. It's not as bad as when they cut off supplies from Russia, because Europe now gets about 60% of its natural gas, its LNG, from the US. But Qatar, I believe it was somewhere around 14% to Europe, is a major contributor. In another sense, that natural gas is incredibly important, or at least that it's not coming out, because it is very important for the production of fertilizers. And without that kind of stock, without the ability to create the raw materials for fertilizers, which rely heavily on natural gas, then that's going to be a problem as well. Now, of course, there's no scarcity necessarily. There's no shortages right now. It's just the prices are shooting through the roof, and so it becomes unaffordable. So that's really the issue, is that is going to then be priced into food stocks as well, because the crop seasons are beginning, and then you have fertilizer, which is so much more expensive because of the lack of gas. And so it's not just for electricity generation, but also for that production of fertilizer.
Yeah, farmers, of course, being hit very hard by more expensive fuel, more expensive fertilizers.
Transport costs on the one side, input costs when it comes to fertilizer. It's a double whammy.
Yeah, very unpleasant for them right now. And also for consumers who have to pay more for their food, of course. Before we go to Africa, I'd like a quick word with you on China. In which way is China affected by this? And what do its actions or non-actions say about their standpoint?
China is really interesting to watch, Gerhard, because on the one hand, they have these massive oil reserves that they're sitting on. They're also, it appears that they are receiving oil still from Iran. And so they've escaped in many ways some of the pressures that you could say that others have, or the fear of shortages. At the same time, they're going to face the same inflationary pressures as everyone else. And for a nation that, like none other in the world, is built on exports right now, there's going to be new prices built into their exports as well, and there's going to be perhaps fewer buyers because of recessionary fears, costs, things like that. So for a country whose model is really built on export, it's going to be a challenge. Now, China has not had the inflationary pressures that everyone else has had over the past years. They've had deflation. And so, you know, you're going suddenly from a situation of deflation where prices are going down to suddenly you have these prices that are rising and being put into your products. And we're really going to see if this model, this export-driven model, is going to function or if it's going to suffer extraordinarily. Because right now you have so many companies in China that are competing with one another. Let's look at the car space, right? We talk about this all the time, electric vehicles. Right now you have tons of capital being poured into these electric vehicle car companies. They're competing tooth and nail with one another. So they're lowering prices. It's a race to the bottom. Well, their margins are super tight, and now you have suddenly the cost of inputs rising, and now their margins are going to be even tighter, and some of them aren't going to make it. We knew from the beginning that some of them were probably going to collapse, but this is going to hasten that process, and it may make companies that would have been winners before, that it may turn them into losers. So it's a really challenging time for China to suddenly face these inflationary pressures from outside.
Now, if we look at the Chinese government, right, and the Chinese economy, which is not a fully communist economy or planned economy, but it's it has elements of it. Do you think that the government in Beijing is better equipped to react to a crisis like this, which is a global crisis and which might become much worse, due to the fact that they can just steer their economy in a different way that market economies can?
I think it's hard to say. In some ways, yes, you could look at it and say that that's the case, that there are edicts that they can issue, there are things that can happen. There's obviously a lot of state support for companies that you wouldn't see in a market-based economy.
Yeah, subsidies.
Subsidies, things like that. But the fact is they're already sitting on piles of debt there, and they don't always have the kind of fiscal space or the willingness to create that fiscal space that you would expect. So it is not a clear issue of they can just wave their magic wand and make things go away. They are sitting on a deflationary economy, high unemployment, a population that does not consume that much. It has bet everything, Beijing has bet everything on this export-driven model that it's just going to push everything out to really keep growth high in the nation. And if that doesn't work, then it's hard to suddenly create an economy in which people have the means to consume. We live in more consumer-oriented economies, Gerhard, here in Western Europe, in the US, for example. In China, you would have to really make some structural changes that the Communist Party would not be comfortable with. This is the way experts have seen it and see it right now. I mean, it would include changes to the tax base, the tax code, more of a redistribution of wealth from certain sectors that have been built up for exports and more towards household wealth. And that would probably bring about some political issues as well for a Communist Party that prefers to have a control over the economy and not leave things to personal expenditure. So it poses real challenges for them, that's for sure.
Now, I want to go to Africa now, as we've promised in the beginning. We're still struggling to get our correspondent there on the line, but Africa, across Africa, the shock waves from the Hormuz choke point are hitting just as hard as in Asia and other places, and in some places more. Mauritius, for example, is down to just 20 days of heavy fuel oil and has begun cutting non-essential electricity use. In Uganda, limited diesel and petrol stocks may last only a few weeks. And Kenya is seeing around 20% of its petrol stations short on supplies, with officials pleading for calm as panic buying is already setting in. Prices are also surging across the continent. In Somalia, the price of fuel has more than doubled in some areas, forcing tuk-tuk drivers in Mogadishu to stop working. Nigeria's petrol prices have also surged by more than 60% in the past 3 weeks. And Egypt has seen fuel prices rise by up to 17%. Across the continent, the message is the same. Africa's energy system is stretched to the limit, and the Hormuz disruption is already reshaping daily life, from transport to food prices to the stability of entire economies. And Stephen, we're still waiting for our correspondent. We're having trouble there getting this connection. But if we look at Africa together, we've just heard these examples. All across the board, the continent is hit like everybody else in the world, but poorer nations there, we heard with that in Mogadishu, of all places, tuk-tuk drivers stopped working. That sounds not like a big deal for us, but across Africa, this situation is going to be much more dire, isn't it?
And these are nations, Gerhard, that in recent years, especially if you look at the pandemic, have really borrowed more and more and built up more and more debt. And debt was already a major issue of the past few years when it comes to Africa, as the debt levels are unsustainable. And to be able to purchase on markets at these high prices, to be able to supply these kinds of fuels, the kinds of commodities that are needed, they're going to have to pay exorbitant prices as well. So what we're going to see is more debt taken on, because also there will be attempts to relieve the pressure on the public as well. And that means more and more debt for nations that are already deeply in it. And I think that's one of the fears that, that from outside looking in that we'll have when we look at these African nations. If there's a point at which they can't get the resources they need to basically continue running things. I mean, I think of Sri Lanka a number of years ago when it basically went bankrupt and it could not pay. They couldn't import gas anymore, and suddenly there were shortages. We've seen Zambia not too long ago also defaulting. And so these are the issues that are very realistic because of the past crises that have happened and that are still on the books of these countries, essentially. And there's been a lot of talk about canceling debts, about trying to provide debt relief, but it's never really happened in a kind of way that can make a difference for these countries. And this is going to be one more burden that they're facing. And that's looking aside from the day-to-day challenges that these people are facing in terms of fuel, in terms of commodities, grains, shipments, things like that. All these prices are going to go up because of fuel. If they're not coming out of that region necessarily. We don't see as many grains coming out of that region as we did when Russia, invaded Ukraine and we had some issues there. But just the cost of getting it there, the cost of transport is rising, and that then puts some of these prices out of reach for a number of countries. That's going to be hard.
Now, from a layman's perspective, I always hear that Africa, or many countries in Africa, are very rich in commodities, and could they be more self-sufficient in terms of I don't know, internal trade maybe?
I mean, it depends. Internal trade barriers are still pretty high across Africa. It's not like the EU where you see these kind of borders that don't exist for economic trade. You don't see a single market yet. There have been attempts for that. What's often the problem with African nations is you have a lot of commodities that are there, but they're often exploited by companies out of nations that have more money, right? And so they're usually for export markets, of course, with some going to the country. And it just depends on how those riches are then used in the country. Getting to this point a little bit, I mean, I think, first of all, some of their issues, when it comes to fuel and things like that, you're not going to see that produced in such massive quantities there that they're going to be able to produce it domestically.
But Nigeria has lots of oil,
Nigeria
right?
does have lots of oil. That's true, actually, and that is one of the exceptions. And what we're going to have to see is whether there will be export restrictions that countries are putting up. India, for example, has, I think, introduced a windfall tax for exporters of fuels because they actually process a lot of fuels for the export market. They want to encourage that fuel to stay in the markets there and to be used for the domestic market. So in theory, you could see Nigeria perhaps do something similar if they have the distribution points and the ways of making that work. But that is going to be a pressure that all of these countries are facing is, what do we continue to export? What do we say? We need this for the domestic market.
Stephen, thank you very much. And I'm afraid we have lost entirely our connection to our correspondent, Dorcas, there. So I'm afraid we cannot make good on the promise to go a bit deeper into the African side of this issue. I'm afraid we have to leave it here. Thank you for your participation in this. Thank you for your questions and your comments. And I hope to see you around next time. We're going live here on YouTube and TikTok from DW News, from the whole team here, and Stephen and me. Thanks for watching.